Mr. Norman Lamb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Charles Kennedy was an immense talent, and it says so much about the man that so many honourable members in this House have spoken with such complete, genuine warmth about Charles. He had the extraordinary ability to reach out beyond the narrow confines of his own party to make genuine friendships with people of other political persuasions and to achieve an extraordinary affinity with people beyond this place, speaking in a language that people understood, not in the language of the Westminster village. And that was a remarkable talent, not shared by very many people here. But I guess, overall, we probably all share an overwhelming emotion that our hearts just go out to young Donald and to his family on this day. That's the most important thing. Our thoughts very much are with you all. I had the privilege of working as Parliamentary Private Secretary to Charles in my first Parliament here between 2003 and 2005. And I saw at close quarters his extraordinary ability, his compassion, his never ceasing courtesy to people. He never lost his temper in dealing with people. He was always polite. He used the power of argument to win his case. And he tragically suffered from an illness that afflicts too many people in our country. And, Mr. Speaker, there is still a stigma that attaches to mental health and to addiction. And we all of us here and beyond, still have a lot to learn in how we combat that stigma and treat it as a genuine illness and try to offer help to the individual as much as we possibly can. There are three things in particular that I remember Charles for. First of all, and I think in a way this was what defined him amongst many members of the public, his stand, his courageous stand on the war in Iraq. And the Prime Minister was absolutely right to reflect on the pressure, the strain that he must have been under when he spoke in this House with the massed ranks of the Labour government and the Conservative benches all against him. But he was steadfast. He knew what he believed. He articulated the case very strongly and very effectively, and he reached out to our country at a very critical moment in our history. The second thing that defines him for me is his internationalism, his total commitment to the European cause, not for any narrow economic case, but because of the real power of the European Union bringing countries together, turning its back as a continent on conflict, working together, trading together, bringing people together. His politics was about uniting people, not dividing people. That's what made his commitment so strong to the European Union. And then finally, his complete commitment to social justice, to challenge injustice wherever he saw it. And, Mr. Speaker, everyone will know that the Liberal voice in our country has been diminished as a result of the general election result. But I and the rest of my party must do everything we can, united together, to ensure Charles's legacy, to rebuild the Liberal voice in our country. And I'm sure that everyone in this House, whatever their political persuasions, will recognise the force of liberalism and the importance that it has in these Houses of Parliament. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Hywel Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for this opportunity to pay tribute on behalf of the current Plaid Cymru group and also on behalf of my former colleagues from the 2001 Parliament, Simon Thomas, Adam Price, and particularly Elvin Llwyd, who was Charles Kennedy's friend and who worked alongside him to oppose the war in Iraq. We opposed the war from the very start, and for us it was very straightforward. We were united in our opposition. For Charles Kennedy, though, I think it was a bigger challenge, taking the brave decision to lead his party against the war, against prevailing opinion here, and in the media, and having to fight to get some of his leading colleagues to follow. Standing against the war was not easy for any of us. It was not a comfortable place to be. But, Mr. Speaker, we have come to this place not to be comfortable, but rather to do what we see as being right. Charles Kennedy took that path, and it is a fitting tribute to him that he prevailed. Today, our thoughts are with his family. For his future legacy, for me, the well-known couplets from the Welsh poet Hiraethog inevitably come to mind. Sigurdod yw clod y cledd, a'r hwd ei anrhydedd. Idleness is the glory of the sword, and rust is its distinction. Charles Kennedy achieved many things, but I think his opposition to the war in Iraq will prove to be his distinction. Heddwch i'w lwch.
Mr. Tim Farron.
Mr. Speaker, I was elected to this House on the 5th of May 2005 with Charles Kennedy as my leader, and he was meant to, in the weeks running up to that election, pay a visit to Westmoreland and Lonsdale, indeed to the University of Cumbria, Ambleside, and he had a very good excuse to miss that appointment, which was the birth of Donald. I remember at that time the immense pride we felt in Charles as our leadership, but the immense pride he felt in becoming a father. And in the weeks that went past and after the election, I won by 267. And when you win by that small amount, everything counts. And I'm quite sure the additional publicity of Donald's birth helped to contribute to the capturing of Westmoreland after 96 years of Tory rule. And I'd say this, as the months went by, and there were a good number of us, I didn't get the phone call. There were positions appointed, shadow and junior shadow ministries appointed. And then I got a phone call, probably in the September, from Charles. And he said, I'm sorry I've not given you a job. I just completely forgot about you. Would you like to be the Youth Affairs spokesperson, which is obviously an entirely natural fit. But that was the only time I ever felt forgotten by Charles. Because a year before that, and a year younger than Charles at his passing, I lost my mum after a long and pretty horrific illness. And I remember seeing him amongst dozens of other candidates, and he knew exactly about the situation that I and my family were going through, and he had immense compassion for me, and he never stopped asking me about the situation, and once she passed away, about how I was. And that was a measure of a man. He went through some very, very difficult things in terms of his personal health. He was always primarily concerned about the well-being of others. He was a persuader, and he was a persuader because he was able to reach people in their gut. People make their minds up on the basis of all sorts of things, but generally speaking, you only move people if you can get people there. So I was elected as the MP for the only SDP MP ever to gain his seat in a general election, by the way. He did that, and then he went on just 4 years later, when the SDP and the Liberals merged, to argue on the conference floor against his own leader, David Owen. And you could see the faces of people in that hall changing their minds because Charles Kennedy reached into their hearts and turned them. And to my mind, what he was so good at was his ability to communicate and get to people. And it wasn't contrived. People will say Charles Kennedy was human. Yes, he was, but he wasn't contrived. The first time I went on, I think it was Any Questions a few years ago, he gave me a piece of advice. He just said, be yourself. Be yourself. Charles was successful because he was himself. And my advice, I guess, to any of you, if you're ever invited on Have I Got News for You, say no unless you want to be made out to be a prat or unless you are Charles Kennedy. And because there's a natural ability to communicate to people because he absolutely was of himself. So that humanity is one thing. His principle, it's been spoken of several times, but I cannot say it and it cannot be said enough. His stance against the Iraq war seems like the populist and right thing to do from today. 12 years ago, it was not. He was surrounded by people baying at him as if he was somehow Chamberlain, as if he was somehow an appeaser of Saddam Hussein. And the Sun had a front-page picture of Charles Kennedy, the anti-patriotic rattlesnake. By golly, you must be doing something right when that happens. And Charles Kennedy was principled, and he changed people's minds, and he was right. He was human, he was principled, and he was effective. He led our party to the largest number of members of this House since Lloyd George's day. And I want to suggest this to you. That humanity, that principle, and that effectiveness those three things are connected. And if we want to understand what Charles Kennedy was great and why Charles Kennedy was great, it was because he was himself. People will say politicians should have a life in politics before they become members of Parliament. Maybe. Charlie was elected at 23. It's hard to argue that he did. The reality is it's not what you have done, it is who you are. And Charles Kennedy was a very, very special man. Donald, you should be really proud of your daddy. I am proud of your daddy. I loved him to bits. I am proud to call him my friend. God rest you, Charlie.
Gisela Stuart.
Charles Kennedy was one of the associate editors of the House magazine, of which I am the editor. And we'd have meetings every Tuesday morning for an hour to discuss what happened during the week and where we would go the following week. Charles made some of the meetings and he didn't make others. But what was always very clear is we had extraordinary, indiscreet exchanges of opinion, which never, ever left the room. For something like 15 years, what was said in that room stayed in that room. And the discussions were always enlightening, because Charles would come up with points of view which just simply hadn't occurred to you to begin with. And it was his extraordinary generosity, even when people were not just stabbing him in the back, it was quite clearly they were stabbing him from the front. He would nevertheless always be generous towards them. But I just want to say something very briefly, given that it's people outside there will hear this as well. I think Donald should read a book by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, where the little prince explains why he's about to die. And he says, I will be a star. And every time you look up on the skies, you will see that star, and it is my smiling. And you will end up to have been glad to have known me. And I think all of us will end up saying, we were glad to have known Charles. Yeah.